It started as just another day in the dusty, sun-soaked town of Ashton. The heat shimmered off the cracked pavement, and a faint breeze carried the scent of oil and gasoline down the quiet streets. Ashton wasn't the kind of town where much happened, just a small speck on the map, surrounded by endless miles of desert. People liked it that way. Simple. Predictable. But sometimes, even the most unremarkable places hold secrets. On the edge of town, nestled between a line of dry shrubs and a long-forgotten diner, stood Mike Reynolds' garage. To anyone passing by, it looked like any other small auto repair shop, a bit worn, a bit messy, and far from fancy. The sign above the entrance had long since faded, the peeling letters barely readable, Reynolds Auto Repairs. Most of the time, the place was quiet except for the hum of engines or the occasional clatter of tools hitting the floor. Mike Reynolds spent his days here, working alone. His hands, calloused and stained with grease, moved with steady precision as he adjusted a carburetor or tightened a loose bolt. He wasn't one for conversation, and that suited most of the townsfolk just fine. To them, he was just the mechanic, a quiet, weathered man in his late 40s with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and a tendency to keep to himself. Few ever stopped to wonder about his past. Mike preferred it that way. Years ago, he'd been someone else entirely. Back then, he was the guy who kicked down doors and made split-second decisions that could save or end lives. As part of an elite SWAT team, Mike had spent 2 decades navigating high-stakes situations most people couldn't even imagine. Armed robberies, hostage rescues, gang takedowns, he'd seen it all. But those years had taken a toll. The constant adrenaline, the danger, the loss, it left scars, both physical and emotional. So, when the time came to walk away, Mike didn't hesitate. He packed up his life, left the city behind, and found his way to Ashton, a quiet town where he could disappear into the background. For 10 years, it worked. Mike kept his head down, fixing cars, trucks, and the occasional motorbike. The locals liked him well enough, even if they didn't understand him. He was reliable, never overcharged, and always got the job done. Some thought he was just a lonely man who'd fallen on hard times. Others assumed he had no ambitions, no dreams, no story worth telling. But they were wrong. On this particular morning, the town was just beginning to stir. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. At the garage, Mike had already been working for hours. He liked the early mornings, the stillness, the chance to focus without distractions. Today, it was an old pickup truck that needed his attention. As he worked, the sound of the town waking up drifted through the open garage doors. The distant clang of a train on rusty tracks. The low murmur of voices from the diner across the street. The occasional bark of a dog chasing after the mailman. Mike barely noticed. He was in his element, his hands moving instinctively as he tightened a bolt and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. But as he reached for a wrench, something caught his attention. A faint sound, low and steady, growing louder with each passing second. He paused, listening. The roar of engines. In a place like Ashton, the sound of motorcycles wasn't unusual. But this wasn't just 1 or 2 bikes cruising through town. This was a pack 10, maybe 12 of them, roaring down Main Street like they owned the place. Mike glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. From his vantage point in the garage, he could see the dust cloud rising as the bikers approached. They were loud, their laughter and shouts echoing off the buildings. The Black Vipers. Mike didn't need an introduction to know who they were. Everyone in Ashton knew about the Black Vipers. They'd been stirring up trouble for months, smashing windows, picking fights, and making life miserable for anyone who dared stand up to them. They were trouble with a capital T, and the sheriff didn't seem inclined to do much about it. Most people learned to stay out of their way. Mike planned to do the same. As the gang rolled past, their leather jackets glinting in the sunlight, Mike turned back to his work. He wasn't looking for trouble. Not today. Not ever. But trouble has a way of finding you, whether you're looking for it or not. By midday, the temperature had climbed to sweltering levels. Mike had just finished fixing the pickup truck when he heard the sound of boots crunching on gravel. He turned to see a shadow stretching across the garage floor. "Hey there, old man." The voice was rough, dripping with mockery. Mike looked up to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and broad, with a jagged scar running down his cheek and an air of arrogance that was impossible to ignore. Behind him, several other bikers lounged against their motorcycles, watching the exchange with amused smirks. Mike straightened, wiping his hands again. "Can I help you?" The leader stepped forward, eyeing the garage like he owned it. "We've got a little problem," he said, motioning to a beat-up bike parked outside. "Think you can fix it?" Mike glanced at the bike. The engine was shot, the frame bent. It was a mess, but nothing he couldn't handle. "Yeah," he said simply. The leader chuckled, a sound that was anything but friendly. "Good. 'Cause I'm not in the mood to wait." Mike didn't respond. He knew their type, men who thrived on intimidation, who pushed and pushed until someone snapped. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. But as he reached for his tools, another biker stepped into the garage. He was younger, wiry, with a mean glint in his eye. Without warning, he knocked over a stack of tools, sending them clattering to the floor. "Oops," he said, grinning. Mike's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. He crouched down to pick up the tools, his movements calm and deliberate. "Not much of a talker, huh?" the leader said, leaning against the workbench. "That's fine. We like quiet types. Makes it easier to persuade them." The gang laughed, the sound grating against Mike's nerves. He stood slowly, his eyes meeting the leader's. For a brief moment, the room seemed to grow still. "Do you want the bike fixed or not?" Mike asked, his voice steady. The leader's smirk faltered, just for a second. But he recovered quickly, stepping closer until he was inches from Mike's face. "Yeah," he said. "Fix it? But don't think for a second we're paying full price." Mike didn't blink. "You'll get it back when I'm done. And you'll pay what it costs." The leader stared at him, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, with a sharp laugh, he stepped back. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that," he said. "But don't push your luck." With that, he turned and walked out, his gang following close behind. As their engines roared to life and they sped off, Mike let out a slow breath. He'd dealt with men like them before. He knew their type all too well. And he knew one thing for certain, they'd be back. For now, he went back to work. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life was about to get a whole lot louder. The afternoon dragged on, heavy with heat. Mike moved deliberately, tools clinking softly as he worked on the battered motorbike the gang had left behind. The damage wasn't just from wear and tear. Someone had clearly abused the machine, riding it hard and neglecting even the most basic maintenance. It wasn't the kind of job Mike enjoyed, but he worked with the same precision and care as always. Fixing things was his way of making sense of the world. Engines made sense. Their problems were straightforward. Broken parts could be replaced, misalignments could be corrected. People, on the other hand, were messy. They lied, they cheated, they destroyed. Mike had seen enough of that during his years on the force to last a lifetime. The bikers were no different. His mind wandered as he tightened a bolt, memories bubbling to the surface uninvited. Flashes of his SWAT days, the shouting, the chaos, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He'd left that life behind for a reason, but moments like this made him wonder if it would ever truly let him go. The faint hum of an approaching vehicle pulled him from his thoughts. Mike straightened, wiping his hands on a rag as a battered sedan rolled into the lot. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, stepped out and gave a small wave. "Afternoon, Mike," the man called. "Afternoon, Frank," Mike replied, his tone neutral. Frank Davis was a regular. His old sedan had seen better days, and Mike had probably repaired every inch of it at least twice. Frank was also one of the few in town who made an effort to talk to Mike, though he rarely got more than a few polite words in return. Frank leaned against the door frame, watching as Mike returned to the motorbike. "Heard those black vipers were causing trouble again," he said, his voice casual but probing. Mike didn't look up. "Something like that." Frank frowned, his gaze sweeping over the garage. "They didn't mess up your place, did they?" "Not yet." The older man let out a low whistle. "You be careful, Mike. Those guys aren't just bullies, they're dangerous. They've got connections, you know. People who wouldn't think twice about making someone disappear." Mike didn't respond, his focus still on the bike. Frank sighed, pushing himself off the door frame. "Well, if you need anything, you let me know. People around here may not say it, but they respect you, Mike. You've always been fair." "Thanks, Frank," Mike said quietly, not breaking his rhythm. The old man lingered for a moment before getting back into his car and driving off, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold, Mike finally finished the bike. He stepped back, inspecting his work with a critical eye. It wasn't perfect, nothing could erase years of abuse, but it would run smoothly now. He wheeled it to the front of the garage, wiping his hands one last time before heading inside to clean up. The day had been long, and his body ached from hours of bending, lifting, and wrenching. He washed up at the sink, the cold water a small relief against the day's heat. But as he reached for a towel, he froze. The distant sound of engines rumbled through the air, growing louder with each passing second. They were back. The black vipers arrived in a swarm, their bikes kicking up clouds of dust as they pulled into the lot. Mike stepped out of the garage, his expression unreadable as he watched them dismount. The leader, Scarface, as Mike had privately dubbed him, strolled forward, his cocky smirk firmly in place. "Looks like you've been busy, old man," Scarface said, nodding toward the repaired bike. "It's done," Mike replied simply. Scarface glanced at the bike, then back at Mike. "Good. But here's the thing. I've been thinking. Fixing that piece of junk couldn't have been worth much. How about we call it even and skip the payment?" The gang erupted in laughter, their voices harsh and grating. Mike's expression didn't change. "It'll cost what we agreed. No more, no less." Scarface's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "You got a death wish, old man? Because I don't think you understand how this works. Around here, we make the rules." Mike didn't blink. "You don't scare me." The words hung in the air, heavy with tension. For a moment, the lot was silent, the bikers exchanging uncertain glances. Then Scarface laughed, a short, sharp bark that broke the stillness. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But guts won't save you." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think you're tough? Let me tell you something. We've dealt with tougher guys than you, and they didn't last long." Mike met his gaze, unflinching. "I've dealt with worse." The leader's smirk twisted into a snarl. Without warning, he grabbed a wrench from a nearby table and swung it at a stack of supplies, sending them crashing to the ground. "Let's see how tough you are when this place is rubble," Scarface growled. The gang whooped and cheered as they joined in, knocking over shelves, smashing windows, and spilling oil across the floor. Mike stood still, his fists clenched at his sides as he watched them tear apart his garage. He could stop them. He knew that. But not yet. Scarface turned back to Mike, tossing the wrench to the ground at his feet. "Consider this a warning," he said. "Next time, it won't just be your garage." With that, he climbed onto his bike and roared off, the rest of the gang following close behind. Mike stood in the wreckage of his shop, his jaw tight and his heart pounding. They thought they'd won. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, Mike began the slow process of cleaning up. Broken glass crunched under his boots as he swept the floor, his movements deliberate and focused. He'd seen worse messes. This was nothing. As he worked, his mind raced. The Black Vipers weren't going to stop, they'd made that clear. But he wasn't going to roll over and let them destroy everything he'd built. He'd spent years trying to leave his old life behind, but maybe, just this once, it was time to bring it back. By the time the sun reached its peak, the garage was mostly back in order. Mike stood in the doorway, looking out at the empty lot. His hands ached, his muscles were sore, but his resolve had never been stronger. He walked to the back of the garage, where a heavy steel chest sat tucked away beneath a workbench. The chest was locked, its surface scarred from years of use. Mike knelt down, pulling a key from around his neck. The lock clicked open, and he lifted the lid. Inside were the tools of his old trade: a tactical vest, a pair of reinforced boots, and a weapon that hadn't seen the light of day in years. Mike ran his fingers over the gear, his mind flashing back to the life he'd tried so hard to leave behind. He'd promised himself he wouldn't go back. But sometimes, promises had to be broken. The Black Vipers wanted a fight. They were about to get one. The roar of engines shattered the morning calm, their guttural growls echoing off the empty streets. Dust rose in their wake as the Black Vipers roared into town, a pack of leather-clad troublemakers with chaos in their eyes and destruction on their minds. The townsfolk didn't even bother looking anymore, they knew better than to cross paths with this gang. Doors were locked, blinds were drawn, and conversations died the moment the rumble approached. Mike heard them before he saw them. The sound was unmistakable, an invasive roar that signaled only one thing: trouble. He kept his head down, his hands busy under the hood of an old pickup truck. He didn't need to look to know what was coming. He'd seen their type too many times before: swaggering bullies who mistook fear for respect. The gang rolled into his lot, their bikes forming a semicircle that boxed in the garage like a pack of wolves cornering their prey. Boots hit the ground, gravel crunching as the riders dismounted, one by one. "Hey, old man," barked their leader, a hulking figure whose face was as jagged as his voice. A deep scar ran from his temple to his jaw, slicing through one eye that glinted with a predatory gleam. "You fix bikes, don't you?" Mike straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. He glanced at the motorcycle they'd wheeled in, a beat-up Harley with a bent frame and an engine that sounded like it was on its last breath. "Yeah, I fix bikes," he said evenly, his tone giving nothing away. The leader sauntered closer, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete floor. "Good," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. "But let's make one thing clear, we're not here to haggle. You'll fix this piece of junk, and we'll pay what we feel like. If we feel like paying at all." The gang laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the garage. One of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, grabbed a wrench off the workbench and tossed it across the room. It clattered loudly against the wall, but Mike didn't flinch. "Hey," the tattooed man jeered. "You deaf, old man? Boss asked if you're good with that deal." Mike's eyes flicked to the leader. He stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "You'll pay what it costs. No more, no less." The leader's smirk disappeared. For a moment, the air in the garage grew heavy, the tension thick enough to choke on. The other bikers exchanged glances, their laughter dying as they waited to see what their boss would do. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," the leader said, his tone dripping with mockery. He picked up a wrench from the workbench, turning it over in his hands like it was some kind of trophy. But guts don't mean much when your shop's in ashes. With a sudden swing, he hurled the wrench across the room. It crashed into a cabinet, denting the metal and scattering tools onto the floor. The gang erupted into cheers, their laughter filling the space like a noxious gas. Mike's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the rag a little too hard. But he didn't rise to their bait. Not yet. "Let's show this guy what happens when you mess with the Black Vipers," the leader snarled. The gang sprang into action. One of them kicked over a stack of oil drums, spilling black slick across the concrete floor. Another swept his arm across a shelf, sending bolts, screws, and spare parts clattering to the ground. A third biker pulled a wrench from his jacket and drove it through the window, shattering the glass in a spray of shards. Still, Mike stayed quiet. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't give them the reaction they were looking for. "Guess he's not much of a talker," one of them sneered, kicking over a toolbox. "Maybe he'll have more to say when this place burns down." Scarface, the leader, took a step closer to Mike, his breath reeking of tobacco and cheap beer. "Here's the deal, old man," he said. "You fix the bike, and we'll think about not torching this dump. But if you try to get cute, well," he gestured toward the oil-slicked floor and broken window. "You get the picture." Without another word, Scarface turned and strode toward his bike, his gang following close behind. Engines roared to life, and within seconds, the lot was empty again, the air thick with the acrid smell of exhaust and spilled oil. Mike stood in the wreckage of his garage, his hands clenched into fists. He took a slow, deep breath, willing the anger to ebb away. They thought they'd intimidated him, scared him into submission. They were wrong. The aftermath was a mess. Shards of glass glittered in the sunlight streaming through the broken window. Tools and parts were scattered everywhere, and the slick black puddle of spilled oil spread like a stain across the concrete floor. Mike grabbed a mop and bucket, his movements slow but deliberate. This wasn't the first time his space had been trashed. He'd seen worse back in his SWAT days: homes destroyed in gang wars, crime scenes left in utter chaos. Cleaning up after the Black Vipers wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't enough to rattle him either. As he worked, his mind churned. These weren't just some rowdy punks looking to make a scene. The Black Vipers were organized, confident in their ability to terrorize without consequence. They didn't just want a free bike repair, they wanted to send a message. But what they didn't know was that Mike had been sending messages of his own, long before they were even old enough to ride. Back then, his message had been clear: don't mess with the innocent. And if you do, be ready to face the consequences. For a decade, he'd buried that part of himself. He'd left behind the badges, the tactical gear, and the high-stakes operations in exchange for a quiet life. But some instincts never fade, and some lines can never be uncrossed. The next day, Mike returned to work as if nothing had happened. The broken window was patched up, the tools were back in their proper places, and the Black Viper's mangled bike sat propped on its kickstand, waiting for repairs. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Mike didn't flinch when the roar of engines filled the air once more. He didn't hesitate when the gang rolled into the lot, their laughter just as coarse, their swagger just as arrogant. This time, he was ready. Scarface strutted into the garage, his smirk as smug as ever. "Well, old man," he said, clapping his hands together. "You get my baby all fixed up." Mike nodded toward the bike. "It's done. Runs better than new." Scarface approached the bike, running a hand along the handlebars. "Good. Real good." He turned to Mike, his grin widening. "Now, about that payment." Mike's eyes didn't waver. 500. Cash. Scarface's grin faltered. 500, he repeated, his voice laced with mock disbelief. I don't think you understand how this works. I'm the one who decides what we pay. No, Mike said calmly, his voice like steel. You're the one who decides how much trouble you want. The gang froze, their laughter silenced as they processed his words. Scarface's smirk twisted into a sneer. You've got a death wish, old man. Mike stepped closer, his eyes locked on the leader. You'd be surprised how many times I've heard that, he said. For the first time, Scarface hesitated. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just stepped into a game he couldn't win. The gang exchanged uneasy glances, caught off guard by Mike's calm defiance. They were used to people cowering, pleading, even. But Mike? He just stood there, his arms crossed, staring down Scarface like the man was nothing more than a mosquito buzzing too close. Scarface scoffed, trying to mask his hesitation. You think you're tough, huh? Fixing engines doesn't make you a fighter, old man. He leaned closer, his voice a low growl. We'll take the bike, and you'll take whatever scraps we feel like tossing your way. That's how it works. Mike didn't move an inch. You're walking a dangerous line, son. The word son hit like a slap. Scarface's face darkened, his hands balling into fists. You've got some nerve. Maybe you need a little reminder of who you're dealing with. He snapped his fingers, and one of the bikers, a hulking brute with arms like tree trunks, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. The man loomed over Mike, grinning like a predator toying with its prey. Should I show him, boss? The brute asked, his voice dripping with anticipation. Scarface gestured lazily. Teach him a lesson. Nothing too permanent, yet. The brute took a step forward, towering over Mike. He reached out, grabbing the front of Mike's shirt and lifting him slightly off the ground. But before anyone could blink, Mike's hand shot up, gripping the biker's wrist like a vice. The room seemed to freeze. With a twist and a sharp jerk, Mike forced the brute's arm back, the motion so fluid and fast that the man barely had time to react. A loud pop echoed through the garage as the biker let out a howl of pain, cradling his now dislocated shoulder. The gang stared, stunned into silence. Mike lowered his arms, his posture as relaxed as ever, though his eyes burned with something fierce, something dangerous. I told you, he said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You're walking a dangerous line. Scarface's face twisted in a mix of shock and fury. You're gonna regret that, he snarled. Maybe, Mike replied, his voice calm but cold. But not today. Scarface didn't back down right away. His pride wouldn't let him. You think you can scare us, he barked, trying to rally his gang. We own this town. You're just some washed-up grease monkey with a death wish. But the confidence in his voice wavered, and the gang wasn't as eager to jump to his command. They just watched their strongest member reduced to a whimpering heap in seconds. Mike stepped closer to Scarface, his movements deliberate. He wasn't just standing his ground, he was claiming it. You've had your fun, he said. Now take your bike and go. And don't come back. Scarface hesitated. He wanted to push, to regain control of the situation, but something in Mike's eyes stopped him. It wasn't fear or anger, it was certainty, a calm, quiet assurance that radiated from the man like heat from a forge. Finally, Scarface spat on the ground. Let's go, he growled, his voice tight with barely contained rage. This ain't over, old man. The gang mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life. Scarface shot one last glare at Mike before leading his crew out of the lot, leaving behind the scent of burnt rubber and bruised egos. Mike watched them go, his expression unreadable. Once they were out of sight, he turned back to the mangled tools and scattered parts. There was no sigh of relief, no moment of relaxation. He knew better. This wasn't over. The Black Vipers didn't take kindly to humiliation. And Scarface? He wasn't the kind of man to let a grudge go. Mike spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up the garage, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of work before, though not always with wrenches and bolts. His movements were steady, but his mind was already working ahead, analyzing the situation, planning for what was coming next. The Black Vipers would be back. And next time, they wouldn't stop at threats. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mike locked up the garage and headed to the small house he called home. The space was modest, a single story with peeling paint and a front porch that creaked underfoot, but it suited him just fine. Inside, he moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of the living room. His fingers hesitated for a moment before he pulled out a key and opened it. Inside was a neatly arranged collection of items: a tactical vest, a pair of heavy-duty gloves, and a well-maintained firearm that gleamed under the dim light. Alongside them was a box of photographs, each one capturing moments from a life he'd tried to leave behind. A younger Mike in full SWAT gear, standing shoulder to shoulder with his team, a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Hostage Crisis Ends in Heroic Rescue," a medal tucked away in a small velvet case. Mike stared at the items for a long moment, his mind churning with memories. He hadn't touched this part of his life in years, hadn't needed to. But the Black Vipers had forced his hand. He closed the cabinet, locking it once more. For now, he would wait. The following days passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. The townsfolk whispered about the incident at the garage, their voices hushed but curious. "Did you hear what Mike did to one of those bikers? Dislocated his arm, they say. Took him down in seconds. Never figured Mike for the fighting type. Guess there's more to him than meets the eye." Mike paid no mind to the rumors. He kept his head down, focusing on his work. But he knew it was only a matter of time before the Vipers returned. And when they did, he'd be ready. The next morning dawned quiet, the town of Ashton seemingly unbothered by the chaos that had unfolded the day before. For most, it was just another day, but for Mike Reynolds, it was the start of something far more serious. He stood outside his garage, his sharp eyes scanning the damage the Black Vipers had left behind. The broken glass from the window caught the sunlight, glittering like tiny daggers. Oil slicks stained the pavement, and the faint smell of burnt rubber hung in the cool morning air. To a casual observer, it looked like just another act of senseless vandalism. But Mike knew better. This was a message. And it wasn't one he planned to ignore. Sheriff Parker arrived mid-morning, stepping out of his dusty cruiser with a clipboard in hand. Parker was a well-meaning man with a soft spot for donuts and small talk, but when it came to serious trouble, his nerves tended to get the better of him. He took off his hat, scratching at his thinning hair as he surveyed the scene. "So, they made a real mess here, huh?" he said, his voice uncertain. Mike didn't bother answering. He simply folded his arms and waited. Parker sighed, scribbling something on his clipboard. "Look, Mike," he began, his tone low and cautious. "These guys, this gang, they're not like the punks we used to deal with around here. They're organized. Dangerous. You remember what happened to old Bill's diner when he refused to play nice, don't you?" Mike's expression remained stony. He remembered. The Black Vipers had trashed the place so thoroughly that Bill had been forced to close up shop for good. "My advice," Parker continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Let this one go. Fix up your garage, keep your head down, and maybe they'll lose interest." Mike didn't respond immediately. Instead, he bent down and picked up a piece of shattered glass, turning it over in his fingers. The sunlight danced on the edges, sharp and dangerous, much like the fire building inside him. "I appreciate the advice, Sheriff," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I don't think these guys are the lose interest type." Parker looked like he wanted to argue, but the look in Mike's eyes stopped him. It wasn't anger, exactly, it was something colder, more calculated. Something that said the matter was already decided. Well, just, be careful, okay? Parker said awkwardly, retreating to his cruiser. I'll, keep an eye out. Mike spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess. He moved with a calm efficiency, picking up shattered tools, mopping up the spilled oil, and patching the broken window with a sheet of plywood. But inside, his mind was racing. This wasn't just about his garage. It was about principle. The Black Vipers had crossed a line, and Mike knew their type all too well. If he didn't stand his ground, they'd just keep pushing, keep terrorizing the town until there was nothing left to ruin. But there was something the Black Vipers didn't know. They didn't know about the life Mike had left behind, the years he'd spent honing skills they couldn't even begin to understand. To them, he was just another quiet, washed-up old man with grease-stained hands and a fading reputation. They had no idea how wrong they were. That evening, long after the sun had set and the streets of Ashton were empty, Mike locked up the garage and headed inside. The small house was dark and quiet, the kind of place that gave no indication of the man who lived there. In the corner of the living room was a chest, nondescript and coated in a fine layer of dust. To anyone else, it might have looked like it was filled with old tools or keepsakes. But Mike knew better. He knelt down and unlocked the chest, the hinges creaking softly as it opened. Inside were the tools of a life he'd sworn to leave behind, a tactical vest, worn but sturdy, steel-reinforced boots, scuffed from years of use, a combat knife, its edge still sharp, and a handgun, meticulously maintained despite its years of disuse. There were other items, 2 mementos of his time as a SWAT officer. A badge, tarnished but still recognizable. A photograph of his old team, their faces young and determined. A commendation for bravery, tucked away in a corner. Mike stared at the contents for a long moment, his mind flooded with memories. He hadn't touched this chest in years, hadn't needed to. But now, as he looked at the gear, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. The next morning, Mike returned to the garage, his routine unchanged on the surface. But beneath his calm exterior, he was already preparing. He spent hours inspecting the Black Viper's bike, his hands moving with practiced precision. The engine was in worse shape than he'd originally thought, and fixing it would take time. But that was fine. Time was exactly what he needed. As he worked, his mind wandered back to his SWAT days. The drills, the missions, the endless planning and preparation. Back then, every decision had been a matter of life and death, every move calculated to minimize risk and maximize results. The Black Vipers didn't realize it, but they'd walked into a game they didn't know how to play. And Mike? He was the one writing the rules. By the end of the day, the bike was mostly repaired. Mike wiped his hands on a rag, stepping back to admire his work. The machine gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the chaos it had caused. But he wasn't done yet. From the back of the garage, Mike retrieved a small, nondescript toolbox. Inside were items that weren't meant for fixing engines, tiny tracking devices, discreetly designed and easy to conceal. It was a trick he'd learned during his years in law enforcement, one that had saved countless lives. Carefully, he attached one of the devices to the underside of the bike's frame, tucking it away where it wouldn't be noticed. He double-checked the placement, ensuring it was secure. When the Black Vipers came back, they'd get their bike. But they'd also be taking a little surprise with them. The sun was setting by the time Mike finished. He stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air. The streets were quiet, the town bathed in the warm glow of twilight. But Mike knew the peace wouldn't last. As he leaned against the garage door, his eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the gang. They hadn't come back yet, but he could feel it in his bones. They were out there, watching, waiting. And so was he. Would you like me to continue building this section, further revealing Mike's preparations and the tension leading to the Viper's next move? The following morning, Mike returned to his routine at the garage, but the air around him felt different, charged with anticipation. The bike sat in the corner, gleaming under the overhead lights, seemingly innocent but carrying the weight of his silent preparations. Every sound, the crunch of gravel under boots, the faint hum of engines in the distance, set his senses on high alert. Years of training had taught him how to detect even the faintest hint of trouble, and he trusted those instincts now more than ever. The day passed without incident, but Mike knew it was only the calm before the storm. He didn't have to wait long. As dusk settled over Ashton, the roar of motorcycles shattered the peace once again. The sound echoed off the buildings, growing louder with every second. Mike stepped outside, his expression neutral as he watched the black Vipers roll into the lot. Scarface dismounted first, his movements deliberate. His gang followed suit, fanning out behind him in a display of intimidation. The air was thick with tension as they approached the garage, their faces twisted with barely concealed contempt. Mike stayed rooted in place, his arms crossed. "Bike's ready," he said evenly, nodding toward the corner of the garage. Scarface sneered. "Good. Maybe you're not as useless as I thought." He motioned for one of his lackeys to retrieve the bike, but the man hesitated, casting a nervous glance at Mike before stepping forward. The gang's bravado was still there, but cracks were beginning to show. "Relax," Scarface said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The old man's not gonna try anything." "Are you, Grandpa?" Mike didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he stepped aside, letting the biker wheel the repaired motorcycle out of the garage. "I fixed your bike," Mike said, his tone calm but firm. "Now we're square. Take it and go." Scarface chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You think it's that simple? You mess with the Black Vipers, you pay the price." He stepped closer, invading Mike's space. "We're not done with you, old man. Not by a long shot." Mike didn't flinch, didn't back down. He met Scarface's glare with a steady gaze, his calm demeanor unnerving the gang leader more than he cared to admit. "Do what you need to do," Mike said quietly. "But remember, actions have consequences." Scarface bristled, his hand twitching toward the knife at his belt. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he smirked, stepping back. "You're not worth the effort," he spat. The gang mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life. As they rode off, Scarface turned to shout over his shoulder, "We'll be back, old man. And next time, you won't see us coming." Mike watched them go, his expression unreadable. He waited until the sound of their engines faded into the distance before stepping back into the garage. He sat at his workbench, his hands resting on the scarred surface. The tracking device he'd placed on the bike was already active, pinging a location to his laptop. A map flickered to life on the screen, a small blinking dot marking the bike's movement. Mike leaned back, his mind racing. The gang wasn't just a threat to him, they were a plague on the town, a group that thrived on fear and chaos. The sheriff wasn't equipped to handle them, and the townsfolk were too scared to fight back. But Mike? He had nothing to lose. Over the next few days, Mike began to piece together a plan. The tracking device provided a steady stream of information, revealing the gang's patterns and hideouts. He spent hours poring over the data, mapping out their movements and identifying weak points. It wasn't just about retaliation, it was about strategy. Mike wasn't interested in a brawl, he wanted precision. He wanted to dismantle the Black Vipers from the inside out. As he worked, memories of his SWAT days came flooding back. The late-night stakeouts, the high-stakes raids, the careful planning that went into every operation. It had been years since he'd operated on that level, but the skills were still there, buried beneath the surface. And now, they were coming back to life. By the end of the week, Mike had everything he needed. The Black Vipers had made themselves predictable, their arrogance blinding them to the possibility of someone fighting back. The gang's primary hideout was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a decaying structure surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusting machinery. It was the perfect place for a group like the Vipers, secluded, easy to defend, and just intimidating enough to keep outsiders away. But Mike wasn't just anyone. Under the cover of darkness, Mike approached the warehouse. He moved like a shadow, his footsteps silent on the uneven ground. The tactical vest he'd once sworn to put away now hugged his frame, the familiar weight a comforting reminder of the life he'd lived. From a distance, he watched the gang through a pair of binoculars. They were gathered around a fire pit, their laughter and jeers echoing in the still night air. Scarface was at the center, holding court like a self-proclaimed king. Mike's gaze hardened. These men thought they were untouchable, that their numbers and reputation made them invincible. They were wrong. Mike wasn't reckless, he knew better than to charge in head first. Instead, he spent the night observing, taking note of every detail: their routines, their weapons, their weak points. By the time dawn broke, he had a clear picture of what he was up against. As he made his way back to town, his mind was already working through the next steps. The Black Vipers had terrorized Ashton for long enough. It was time to take the fight to them. The night was thick with silence, the kind that suffocates the senses and amplifies every creak and rustle. The Black Vipers' hideout, an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, loomed like a hulking beast against the horizon. Inside, the gang was in high spirits, laughing and jeering as bottles clinked and smoke curled toward the high, broken rafters. Scarface sat in the middle of the chaos, his boots propped on a crate and a cigar dangling from his lips. He was in his element, regaling his crew with exaggerated tales of their misdeeds. "What's next, boss?" one of the bikers asked, leaning forward with a smirk. "Another stop by the old man's garage?" Scarface chuckled darkly. "That geezer? He's probably shaking in his boots. I say we torch the place next time. Send a real message." The gang erupted in laughter, their bravado filling the room. Outside, in the inky blackness of the moonless night, Mike crouched low, his breath steady and his mind sharp. He was dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, his tactical vest strapped snugly to his chest. The tools of his trade, zip ties, flashbangs, and a flashlight, were tucked neatly into the vest's compartments. Mike wasn't here for vengeance. He was here to end this. The first sign that something was wrong came when the gang's lookout, stationed by the main gate, disappeared. He'd been leaning lazily against his post, a cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. A hand clamped over his mouth, and in seconds, he was unconscious, dragged out of sight without a sound. Inside the warehouse, the gang remained oblivious, their laughter echoing through the cavernous space. But then, the power went out. The lights flickered once before plunging the room into darkness. "What the hell?" one of the bikers growled, fumbling for his flashlight. Scarface shot to his feet, his eyes darting around. "Stay sharp," he barked, his voice slicing through the confusion. "This isn't a coincidence." Mike moved like a shadow, slipping through the warehouse's periphery with practiced ease. He'd spent days preparing for this moment, studying the gang's habits and the layout of their hideout. Every step he took was deliberate, every decision calculated. He struck quickly and without warning. The first biker barely had time to register the movement before Mike's elbow connected with his temple, sending him crumpling to the ground. Another lunged at him with a crowbar, but Mike sidestepped the attack, his years of training guiding his movements. A swift knee to the gut followed by a sharp jab sent the second man sprawling. The chaos erupted like a thunderstorm. "Get him!" Scarface roared, pulling a knife from his belt. But Mike was already moving, his body a blur of precision and power. He ducked under a swinging chain, swept a biker's legs out from under him, and delivered a punch that left another gasping for air. The bikers, so used to intimidating others with their numbers, found themselves outmatched. Their arrogance dissolved into panic as they realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary man. One by one, the gang fell. Mike disarmed a biker swinging a lead pipe, twisting the weapon out of his grasp before delivering a knockout blow. Another tried to flee, but a well-aimed throw of a zip tie tripped him up, sending him crashing to the ground. The room was a cacophony of grunts, thuds, and shouts, but Mike remained calm, his focus unwavering. Years of SWAT training surged through his veins, each movement efficient and deliberate. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The Black Vipers were subdued, their hands zip-tied behind their backs as they knelt in a ragged line against the wall. Their weapons, a motley collection of knives, chains, and makeshift clubs, were piled in a corner, far out of reach. Mike stood in front of them, his breathing steady despite the exertion. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with an intensity that silenced any protests before they could be uttered. Scarface was the only one who dared to speak. He struggled against the zip ties, his bravado still clinging to him like a second skin. "You think this changes anything, old man?" he spat, glaring up at Mike. "You don't scare us." "Will." Mike silenced him with a single look, stepping forward until he was mere inches from the gang leader. "Here's the thing," Mike said, his voice low and steady, each word deliberate. "You don't mess with people trying to make an honest living. And you sure as hell don't mess with me." He crouched down, meeting Scarface's glare head-on. "You think you're tough because you've got numbers? Because you push people around and make them afraid? Let me tell you something." Mike's voice dropped even lower, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. "Fear only works when there's no one willing to stand up to it. But I've faced worse than you. And I don't scare easy." Scarface's bravado faltered. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. Mike straightened, addressing the rest of the gang. "This town? It's done with you. You've taken enough, hurt enough people. It ends tonight." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Sheriff Parker? I've got something for you," he said, his tone casual. "Might want to bring some backup." The gang's eyes widened as the realization sank in. They weren't getting out of this one. When the sheriff arrived, his jaw dropped at the sight before him. The Black Vipers, the scourge of Ashton, were lined up like schoolboys caught cheating on a test. Their weapons were neatly piled in a corner, and Mike stood over them, calm and composed. "Mike," Parker began, struggling to find the words. What did you do?" Mike shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Just cleaning up a mess." As the sheriff and his deputies hauled the gang away, Mike stood in the warehouse's doorway, watching the lights of the police cars fade into the night. The air was quiet again, the kind of quiet that signaled the end of something and the beginning of something new. He turned and walked away, his steps steady and unhurried. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The Black Vipers had underestimated him. The town had underestimated him. But Mike Reynolds. He knew exactly who he was. As the tail lights of the sheriff's cars disappeared into the distance, Mike lingered at the edge of the warehouse. The cold night air brushed against his face, carrying with it a sense of finality. He inhaled deeply, taking in the silence. For years, he'd avoided confrontation, burying his past under layers of grease and wrenches. Tonight, those layers had been peeled back, exposing the part of him he thought he'd left behind forever. But this wasn't a time for reflection, it was far from over. After returning to his garage, Mike locked the door and sat down at his workbench. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a heavy sense of responsibility. Yes, the Black Vipers were in custody, but Scarface's final glare, the way he spat threats even as he was hauled off, stuck in Mike's mind like a thorn. "They'll come back," he murmured to himself. They always do. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Sheriff Parker. "Mike," the sheriff's voice came through, laced with unease. "I hate to say this, but we've got a problem. Scarface isn't talking, and the rest of his gang's clammed up too. We've got enough to keep them for a while, but there's chatter about reinforcements. Word on the street is they've got allies in the next county over." Mike rubbed his temples. He'd suspected as much. The Black Vipers weren't just a ragtag group of thugs, they were part of a larger network. Taking down the local chapter was like cutting off a single head of a hydra. More would grow in its place. "What are you saying, Parker?" Mike asked, though he already knew the answer. "I'm saying it's not over," the sheriff admitted. "And if these reinforcements show up, we're going to need all the help we can get." Mike ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He'd been hoping for closure, but that hope was fleeting. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about protecting the town, the people who had come to depend on him even if they didn't know it. His eyes fell on the tactical vest hanging in the corner, its presence a silent reminder of the life he'd tried to leave behind. The weight of it was more than physical, it was symbolic, a choice he'd made to step away from the violence and chaos of his past. But tonight, that choice no longer felt like a luxury. The next morning, Mike returned to his routine at the garage. He kept his head down, fixing cars and exchanging pleasantries with his regular customers. The townsfolk treated him the same as they always had, just Mike, the quiet mechanic who could fix anything with an engine. But underneath the surface, Mike was preparing. Every interaction, every glance out the window, every clink of a wrench against metal carried a sense of anticipation. He wasn't waiting for trouble to find him, he was getting ready to meet it head on. He started small, gathering supplies he could use in case the situation escalated. He reinforced the garage's doors and windows, ensuring the place could hold its own if push came to shove. In the evenings, he mapped out the town, identifying key locations and potential vulnerabilities. The Black Vipers or whoever came in their place wouldn't catch him off guard. Meanwhile, Sheriff Parker did his part, quietly rallying the townsfolk. Though most of them were reluctant to get involved, a handful stepped up, offering their help in whatever way they could. One of them was Mary, the owner of the diner down the road. She'd known Mike since he first moved to Ashton, and while she didn't know the details of his past, she'd always sensed there was more to him than met the eye. "I heard about what you did," she said one evening, bringing him a plate of food. "Taking down those bikers. You didn't have to do that, but you did." "Why?" Mike hesitated, his fork hovering over the plate. "Someone had to," he said simply. "They were hurting people, taking what they wanted without a second thought. I couldn't just stand by." Mary nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Well, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." As days turned into weeks, the town held its breath. The Black Vipers had gone silent, but the absence of noise only heightened the tension. Mike knew this wasn't the end, it was the eye of the storm. Then it came. One night, the sound of engines shattered the stillness once again. But this time, it wasn't a handful of bikes, it was a horde. Dozens of motorcycles roared into Ashton, their riders clad in leather and chains. These weren't just reinforcements, they were a full-blown army, and they weren't here to negotiate. Mike stood outside his garage, watching as the gang descended upon the town like a pack of wolves. The leader, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a tattoo snaking up his neck, dismounted and surveyed the scene with cold, calculating eyes. "Where's the guy who took down my boys?" he demanded, his voice booming. "I want him. Now." The streets were eerily quiet, the townsfolk peeking out from behind curtains and cracked doors. No one stepped forward. Except Mike. He walked into the middle of the street, his movements calm and deliberate. The gang's leader turned to face him, his expression a mix of amusement and disdain. "You," the man scoffed. "You're the one who caused all this trouble." Mike didn't respond immediately. Instead, he locked eyes with the leader, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You've been taking what doesn't belong to you," Mike said finally, his voice steady but firm. "Hurting people who can't fight back. That ends tonight." The gang erupted into laughter, the sound grating and hollow. The leader stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Mike. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered. "You're just one man." Mike's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's the thing about one man," he said. "If he knows what he's doing, one is enough." What happened next was chaos. Mike had prepared for this moment, setting traps and fortifying key positions around the town. As the gang spread out, their overconfidence blinding them to the danger, Mike struck. Smoke bombs erupted from hidden locations, disorienting the bikers. Chains rigged across alleys sent motorcycles skidding out of control. In the confusion, Mike moved through the shadows like a ghost, taking out the gang one by one. The townsfolk, inspired by his courage, joined the fight. Mary and a few others used their knowledge of the town to funnel the gang into traps, cutting off their escape routes. Sheriff Parker and his deputies provided backup, finally finding the resolve to stand up to the threat. By the time dawn broke, the gang was subdued. Those who hadn't fled were rounded up and handed over to the sheriff. The leader, once so confident and imposing, now knelt in the dirt, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Mike stood over him, his expression unreadable. "You should have left well enough alone," he said quietly. The leader didn't respond, his head bowed in defeat. As the sun rose over Ashton, the town was quiet once more. The people emerged from their homes, their expressions a mix of relief and awe. Mike, the quiet mechanic they'd underestimated for so long, had done what they thought was impossible. He didn't stay to bask in their gratitude. Instead, he returned to his garage, his movements slow and deliberate. The fight was over, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. For now, though, the town was safe. And Mike? He'd earned a moment of peace. By the time the sun rose over Ashton, the town felt different. The air was lighter, the streets quieter, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted. The sheriff, Sheriff Parker, had arrived at the warehouse to oversee the final stages of the gang's arrest, his eyes wide in disbelief as he took in the sight before him. "Mike, how did you?" Parker started, but his voice trailed off, unable to fully comprehend what he was seeing. The Black Vipers, known for their ruthlessness and terrorizing ways, were lined up against the warehouse wall, their hands cuffed behind their backs. Their leader, the imposing Scarface, was sitting with his head lowered, his once fearsome demeanor now shattered. The gang members who had been so confident and cruel just the night before now looked like nothing more than common criminals, their arrogance replaced by fear and regret. Mike stood in front of them, his posture calm and collected, his expression unwavering. He didn't say a word at first, just surveyed the scene with a quiet intensity. "Let's just say they underestimated the wrong mechanic," Mike finally replied, his voice steady and free of boastfulness. It was clear that he wasn't interested in the praise or admiration that was undoubtedly coming his way. This was about something bigger than him. Sheriff Parker looked over at Mike, a mix of disbelief and admiration in his eyes. He'd known Mike for years, but this was a side of him the sheriff had never imagined. Mike had always been the quiet, reliable mechanic, the one who kept to himself, fixing cars and making sure everything ran smoothly. Never once had Parker suspected that beneath the grease-stained overalls and unassuming demeanor was someone capable of taking down an entire gang single-handedly. The sheriff shook his head, still processing everything. "I never thought I'd see the day," he muttered, more to himself than to Mike. But Mike didn't reply. He didn't need to. The gang members, their heads lowered in shame, had already given their answer. The story spread quickly throughout the small town of Ashton. News of the Black Viper's defeat spread like wildfire, and by the time the sun set that evening, everyone knew what had happened. The quiet mechanic, who had spent years staying out of the spotlight, had single-handedly brought down one of the most feared gangs in the region. At first, there was disbelief. People in town who had never given Mike a second thought, who had dismissed him as just another grizzled, middle-aged mechanic who lived a simple life, could hardly believe what they were hearing. How could Mike, of all people, be the one to take down a gang that had been terrorizing them for months? But as the days passed, something began to change. People started looking at Mike with new eyes. The guy who'd always kept to himself, who spent his days under the hood of cars and his nights alone in his garage, had suddenly become a hero in their eyes. They'd all underestimated him, not realizing that beneath his quiet exterior was a man capable of extraordinary things. The shop, which had once been just another run-down business on the edge of town, quickly became a symbol of resilience. It wasn't just a place to fix cars anymore, it was a place that represented everything the town stood for. Mike's garage stood as a testament to strength, to the power of quiet determination, and to the idea that even the most unassuming people could rise to the occasion when the time came. Mike, however, wasn't interested in being a hero. To him, it had always been about doing what was right. He'd never wanted anyone to see him as more than just the mechanic. He didn't want a parade, didn't need the accolades. But whether he liked it or not, the town saw something in him now that they hadn't before, a man who, in the face of danger, stood his ground and protected those who couldn't protect themselves. As he went about his daily work, fixing engines and replacing parts, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. People came into the garage with a different kind of respect, a newfound appreciation for the man they'd so easily overlooked. "Hey Mike, can you take a look at this?" one of his regulars asked one morning, holding up a broken-down engine. Mike nodded and motioned for the man to bring it over, just like he had 1,000 times before. But this time, the customer's tone was different, more respectful, less dismissive. Mike didn't mind, though. He preferred it that way. Word spread even beyond Ashton. The small town that had once been overlooked was now the place where the mechanic had taken down the infamous Black Vipers. Strangers began passing through, some just to visit the garage, others looking to catch a glimpse of the man who had changed the town's fate. Even the local paper picked up the story. The headline read, "Quiet Mechanic Defeats Black Vipers, Saves Town." The article was brief, more focused on the gang's arrest and the sheriff's statement than on Mike himself, but the few lines that mentioned him were enough to catch the town's attention. But Mike wasn't interested in the fame. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He was content with his quiet life, working on cars and keeping to himself. Still, he couldn't deny that things had changed. He'd earned the respect of the town, something that had once felt like a distant dream. People who had once ignored him now nodded in acknowledgement as they passed by the garage. The town that had once viewed him as nothing more than an old mechanic now saw him as someone who had done something extraordinary. That morning, as Mike was finishing up a particularly tricky repair on a vintage truck, the sound of a familiar voice interrupted his concentration. "Mike, got a minute?" Sheriff Parker called from the door, stepping into the garage with his usual warm but slightly worn-out smile. Mike straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag and tossing it aside. "What's up, Sheriff?" Parker looked around the garage for a moment, as if taking in the changes that had come with Mike's newfound respectability. Then he turned back to Mike, his face serious. "I just wanted to thank you, Mike. For everything. The town's safe because of you. And I'm not just talking about the Black Vipers. You've changed everything around here." His voice was sincere, his words carrying the weight of months of tension and fear that had finally been lifted. Mike gave a small shrug, the humility that had always been a part of him shining through. "Just did what needed to be done, Sheriff." No big deal. Parker smiled, clearly having expected that response. Well, just know this, he said, leaning in slightly. If you ever need anything at all, you've got the whole town behind you. We may have underestimated you before, but we sure don't now. Mike didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the sheriff, his gaze steady. For the first time in years, he felt like he truly belonged in Ashton. He hadn't just saved the town from the Black Vipers, he'd earned his place in it. Thanks, Parker, Mike said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. I appreciate that. The sheriff nodded and turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, he paused and glanced back one more time. Just remember, Mike. You're not invisible anymore. And with that, the sheriff left the garage, leaving Mike alone with his thoughts. As the weeks passed, life in Ashton slowly returned to normal. The Black Vipers, once a source of fear and anxiety, were now a distant memory. The town, though forever changed, was finally at peace. And Mike, the quiet mechanic, continued to do what he did best, fixing cars and earning the respect of those who had once looked past him. But now, when people walked into his garage, they saw more than just a man with grease on his hands. They saw someone who had given everything to protect the town he loved, someone who had proven that sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who can make the biggest difference. And that, in itself, was enough. Mike never sought recognition or gratitude. He had never wanted to be seen as a hero, nor did he crave applause or admiration. For Mike, it had always been about something deeper. It was about the peace he had fought so hard to find, the peace he had earned after years of fighting battles in ways most people could never understand. He didn't want to be remembered as the man who brought down a gang. He wanted to be remembered as the one who helped keep the town safe, the one who quietly worked behind the scenes, ensuring that life could go on without fear. He didn't need the attention. He didn't need anyone to acknowledge him. All he needed was for the people around him to live their lives in peace, to go about their day without wondering if the next moment would bring danger or chaos. That was the life Mike had always wanted, a simple life, one where he could work with his hands and be left in peace. But the town had changed. The people of Ashton had seen something in him that they hadn't noticed before. And while he didn't ask for it, they had given him respect that Mike had earned not through words, but through actions. He hadn't fought to be recognized, but in doing what was right, he had shown the town the power of quiet strength. It was a lesson Mike had learned long ago. People often overlook the quiet ones. They assume that silence means weakness, that those who don't speak up are somehow less capable, less powerful. But Mike knew better. He knew that silence could be the strongest weapon of all, that sometimes, the ones who say the least are the ones who are capable of doing the most. In a world that often rewards noise, it is the quiet ones who often go unnoticed, but they hold within them the greatest strength. And so, Mike kept his head down. He went back to his shop, fixed the cars, and worked through his days, just as he had before. But now, there was a change. It wasn't something obvious. It wasn't something that everyone could see. But there was a shift in the way people treated him. There was a new respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who had done something no one thought possible. And though Mike never sought it, he knew that he had earned it. He had earned it by being himself, by doing what he knew was right. The town had been tested, and it had passed. The Black Vipers, once a source of fear, were no longer a threat. The people who had once looked at Mike as nothing more than the quiet mechanic now saw him for what he truly was, a man of courage, a man of strength, and a man who had protected the town when it needed him most. And in doing so, he had proven that you don't have to be loud or flashy to make a difference. You don't need to seek recognition or praise. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up, stand your ground, and let your actions speak for themselves. As Mike stood outside his garage one evening, watching the sun set over Ashton, he thought about everything that had happened. It had been a long road, one that he had never expected. He had once thought that his past was something he could leave behind, something he could forget. But in the end, his past had come back to shape his future in ways he had never imagined. And while it had been difficult, it had also been necessary. The Black Vipers had underestimated him, just like so many others had before. They had assumed that because he was quiet, because he lived alone in his little shop on the edge of town, he was nothing more than an old man who had forgotten how to fight. But they had learned the hard way just how wrong they were. And that, Mike thought, was the real lesson. Sometimes, the quietest people hide the loudest stories. They don't speak often, but when they do, their words carry weight. They don't stand in the spotlight, but when the moment calls for it, they step into the darkness with strength and resolve. The loudest people in the room are often the ones who have the least to say. It's the quiet ones, the ones who don't crave attention, who are capable of changing the world when the time comes. Mike had never sought out conflict. He had never wanted to be the center of attention. All he had wanted was peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing that no matter what happens, you've done what you can to protect the people you care about. And in the end, that's all that mattered. As the town settled into its new normal, with the fear of the Black Vipers now gone, Mike knew that his life had changed. He was no longer just the mechanic in the small town. He was something more. He was a symbol of strength, of quiet resilience, and of the power that lies within the ones who are often overlooked. People would remember him now, but it didn't matter to him. What mattered was that he had done the right thing, that he had protected the people of Ashton when they needed him most. He had shown them that it wasn't about being loud or flashy. It wasn't about seeking recognition. It was about standing your ground, doing what needed to be done, and never letting anyone underestimate you. Mike had learned that lesson long ago. And now, the whole town had learned it too. The quietest people, the ones who don't seek the spotlight, are often the ones who can make the biggest difference. And those who push them too far, who assume that their silence is weakness, will find out the hard way just how wrong they were. Mike smiled to himself as he locked up his garage for the night. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. The town knew who he was now. And that was enough.